The Adani Empire Deception. In November 2024, the financial world was rocked by allegations that would shake one of Asia's most powerful business empires to its core. Gautam Adani, chairman of India's massive Adani Group conglomerate and one of the world's richest individuals, found himself at the center of a bribery and fraud scandal so vast it reached the highest levels of government across multiple countries. What emerged was a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had allegedly funneled over $250 million in bribes to Indian government officials, while systematically deceiving American investors who were funding renewable energy projects they believed were legitimate. The Adani Group's business empire spans ports, airports, power generation, and renewable energy infrastructure across India and beyond. With operations that touch virtually every aspect of India's economic development, the conglomerate had built a reputation as a driving force behind the country's modernization efforts. But federal prosecutors in Brooklyn would reveal that this success was built on a foundation of corruption that stretched from boardrooms in Mumbai to investment offices in New York. The scheme centered on lucrative solar energy contracts with the Indian government that Adani and his associates allegedly secured through systematic bribery. These weren't small payments to expedite routine business. The indictment describes a carefully orchestrated campaign of corruption that involved paying massive bribes to secure contracts worth billions of dollars in revenue over decades. The solar energy projects were positioned to American investors as clean, profitable investments in India's renewable energy future, attracting hundreds of millions of dollars from institutional investors and pension funds. What made the cover-up particularly sophisticated was how the defendants allegedly concealed their criminal activity from the American investors who were funding the projects. Federal prosecutors discovered that Adani and his associates had created elaborate financial structures designed to hide the bribery payments while presenting false and misleading information to investors about the true nature of their business operations. The scheme involved multiple jurisdictions, complex financial instruments, and carefully crafted documentation that painted a picture of legitimate business activities while concealing the underlying corruption. The international scope of the cover-up became clear when investigators revealed that although the alleged criminal activity occurred primarily in India, the case was being prosecuted in Brooklyn federal court because of specific actions that took place in New York in connection with the bribery scheme and capital-raising efforts. This jurisdictional complexity demonstrates how modern financial crimes can span continents while exploiting different legal systems to avoid detection and accountability. As the investigation deepened, prosecutors uncovered evidence that several defendants had actively conspired to obstruct both federal criminal investigations and Securities and Exchange Commission inquiries into the bribery scheme. The obstruction allegedly included making false statements and omitting material facts in documents related to bond issuances that raised capital for the solar energy contracts. This systematic effort to mislead investigators shows how the cover-up evolved from hiding the original crimes to actively interfering with law enforcement efforts to uncover the truth. The Evergrande catastrophe. While the Adani scandal was unfolding, an even larger corporate fraud was reaching its conclusion in China, where regulators had uncovered what may be the biggest accounting fraud in corporate history. China Evergrande Group, once the country's largest property developer, had systematically inflated its revenues by a staggering $78 billion over multiple years, creating a financial deception so massive it would ultimately contribute to a crisis that threatened China's entire real estate sector. The scale of the fabrication was breathtaking in its audacity and precision. Chinese regulators discovered that Hengda Real Estate, the group's main Chinese unit, had fabricated 214 billion yuan, approximately $30 billion, in sales for 2019 alone. This false revenue accounted for half of the company's reported income that year. The deception continued into 2020 when another 350 billion yuan, roughly $48.6 billion in sales, were completely fabricated, representing 78% of that year's reported revenue. The financial impact of these fabrications was devastating for investors and creditors who relied on Evergrande's financial statements to make investment decisions. The falsified sales figures inflated 2019's net profit by 63% and 2020's net profit by an extraordinary 87%. Creating the illusion of a profitable, growing company when the reality was far different. These inflated numbers supported bond issuances and attracted international investment that would ultimately be lost when the fraud was exposed. What made the Evergrande fraud particularly damaging was the involvement of one of the world's most prestigious accounting firms in the cover-up. PricewaterhouseCoopers, a Big Four auditing firm trusted by investors worldwide, was found to have violated multiple audit standards and failed to detect the massive fraud despite their responsibility to verify the accuracy of financial statements. Chinese regulators determined that PwC had produced inaccurate working papers, conducted ineffective on-site inspections, and issued clean audit reports despite the presence of obvious red flags that should have triggered additional investigation. The regulatory response to PwC's role in the cover-up was swift and severe. The China Securities Regulatory Commission imposed a penalty of 4.175 billion won, approximately $580 million, on Hengda Real Estate, while company founder Zhu Jiayin was personally fined 47 million yuan, about $6.5 million. But the punishment extended beyond financial penalties to operational restrictions that would fundamentally impact PwC's business in China. The accounting firm was banned from signing off on any financial results in China for 6 months, effectively shutting down a significant portion of their operations in one of the world's largest economies. This ban represented more than just a financial penalty. It was a signal from Chinese regulators that even the most prestigious international firms would face serious consequences for participating in financial fraud cover-ups. The systematic nature of the fraud and cover-up revealed deeper problems within China's corporate governance system and the international auditing industry. The fact that such massive fabrications could continue for multiple years despite oversight from a major international auditing firm raised questions about the effectiveness of current financial reporting and audit procedures, particularly for companies operating in emerging markets with complex regulatory environments. The collapse of Evergrande had global ramifications that extended far beyond China's borders. International investors who had purchased Evergrande bonds found themselves holding worthless paper backed by fabricated financial statements. The crisis contributed to broader concerns about Chinese property market stability and had ripple effects throughout global financial markets as investors reassessed the reliability of financial reporting from Chinese companies. Real quick, if you're learning something new from this video, be sure to like and drop a comment with your favorite. It helps us to spread this info to those who need to hear it most. Also, subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss what we reveal next. Trust me, there's a whole lot more hidden. Now back to it. The cryptocurrency empire collapse. As traditional industries grappled with massive fraud scandals, the rapidly evolving world of cryptocurrency was experiencing its own spectacular collapse that would reshape how the world viewed digital assets and their regulation. Sam Bankman-Fried, once celebrated as a poster boy for the cryptocurrency revolution and ranked as the 41st richest American, had built what prosecutors would later describe as one of the largest financial frauds in American history. FTX, Bankman-Fried's cryptocurrency exchange, had achieved global reach with more than 130 international affiliates and billions of dollars in customer deposits. The platform was marketed as a safe, regulated alternative to other cryptocurrency exchanges, with sophisticated risk management systems and strong financial controls that would protect customer funds from the volatility and security issues that plagued other crypto platforms. This reputation for safety and reliability attracted deposits from individual investors, institutional clients, and even government entities seeking exposure to digital assets. Behind the impressive marketing and public relations campaigns, however, was a systematic scheme to misappropriate customer funds for Bankman-Fried's personal use and to cover massive losses at Alameda Research, his cryptocurrency trading firm. From 2019 to 2022, prosecutors discovered that Bankman-Fried had been the leader and mastermind of a scheme to defraud FTX customers by misappropriating billions of dollars of customer deposits that were supposed to be held in segregated accounts for trading purposes. The scope of the misappropriation was staggering in both its scale and brazenness. Customer funds were used to make high-risk investments through Alameda Research, fund millions of dollars in political contributions to candidates from both parties, purchase luxury real estate in the Bahamas, and support Bankman-Fried's lavish lifestyle that included private jets, expensive cars, and a sprawling compound in Nassau. The systematic diversion of customer funds violated basic principles of financial custody and represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust that FTX customers had placed in the platform. The cover-up involved creating false and misleading financial statements that concealed the misuse of customer deposits from both regulators and investors. Bankman Fried and his associates provided fabricated information to lenders and equity investors that painted a picture of financial stability and proper risk management, while hiding the fact that billions of dollars in customer funds had been diverted for unauthorized purposes. As questions about FTX's financial stability began to surface in November 2022, Bankman-Fried engaged in a desperate public relations campaign designed to maintain confidence in the platform and prevent a run on customer deposits. On November 8, 2022, he posted on Twitter that FTX is fine, assets are fine. These statements were deliberately false and misleading, designed to buy time while he attempted to find additional funding to cover the massive hole in customer accounts. The collapse happened with stunning speed once the truth became apparent. Within days of the first serious questions being raised about FTX's financial condition, depositors rushed to withdraw their assets, forcing the company into bankruptcy when it became clear that the customer funds were not available. The rapid collapse exposed the fundamental weakness of the entire operation and revealed that what appeared to be a sophisticated financial platform was actually an elaborate fraud designed to enrich its founder at the expense of customer deposits. The investigation and prosecution that followed would reveal the full extent of the scheme and its devastating impact on customers who had trusted FTX with their savings and investments. Federal prosecutors determined that the fraud had resulted in the loss of approximately $10 billion in customer money, making it one of the largest financial frauds in American history, and fundamentally changing how regulators and investors viewed cryptocurrency platforms and their governance structures. The pharmaceutical price manipulation conspiracy. While cryptocurrency markets were reeling from the FTX collapse, another scandal was exposing the dark underbelly of pharmaceutical pricing and corporate manipulation. Martin Shkreli, who would become known as the most hated man in America, had orchestrated a complex web of fraud that combined securities violations, corporate manipulation, and predatory pricing practices that endangered patient access to life-saving medications. Shkreli's criminal enterprise operated across multiple companies and investment funds, creating a sophisticated network of financial deception that allowed him to maintain his fraudulent operations for years. His hedge funds, MSMB Capital Management and MSMB Healthcare, were essentially operated as Ponzi schemes, where he used assets from subsequent companies to pay off defrauded investors from previous ventures. This pattern of using new investor money to cover losses from earlier investments created an ever-expanding web of financial obligations that required increasingly desperate measures to maintain. The securities fraud began with systematic deception of investors about the performance of his hedge funds. When MSMB Capital Management suffered massive losses from failed investments and risky trading strategies, Shkreli lied to investors about the fund's performance and fabricated financial statements to conceal the true extent of the losses. Rather than acknowledging the failures and allowing investors to make informed decisions about their investments, he created false documentation and provided misleading updates that painted a picture of success while hiding devastating losses. The cover-up became more sophisticated as Shkreli moved from one company to another, using each new venture to address problems created by previous failures. When MSMB Capital Management faced a catastrophic loss of over $7 million from a failed short-selling transaction, Shkreli misappropriated $900,000 from MSMB Healthcare to settle the claims from the executing broker who had been forced to cover the position. This cross-company manipulation of funds demonstrated a pattern of using corporate assets as personal resources without regard for fiduciary responsibilities or investor rights. The most audacious aspect of Shkreli's scheme involved his use of Retrophin, a biopharmaceutical company he controlled, to resolve claims from disgruntled investors in his failing hedge funds. Between September 2013 and March 2014, Shkreli fraudulently induced Retrophin to issue stock and make cash payments to investors who were threatening legal action over losses in his hedge funds. These payments were disguised as consulting agreements, but their true purpose was to buy the silence of investors who could expose the fraud if they pursued legal remedies. The cover-up extended beyond financial manipulation to include intimidation and harassment of former employees who posed threats to the scheme. Federal prosecutors discovered evidence that Shkreli had threatened and harassed a former MSMB employee and his family members, demonstrating his willingness to use personal intimidation to maintain his fraudulent operations. This pattern of threatening behavior created a climate of fear that discouraged potential whistleblowers from coming forward with information about his criminal activities. While these securities violations were serious enough, Shkreli's most notorious action involved his acquisition of the manufacturing rights to Daraprim, an anti-parasitic drug used to treat life-threatening infections in immunocompromised patients. In September 2015, his company, Pharmaceuticals, obtained the license for Daraprim and immediately raised the price from $13.50 to $750 per pill, representing an increase of over 5,000% overnight. This price manipulation had immediate and devastating effects on patient access to essential medication. Hospitals and patients who had previously been able to afford treatment found themselves facing crushing costs for a drug that had been available affordably for decades. The price increase was not based on new research, improved formulation, or increased manufacturing costs. It was simply an exploitation of the monopoly position that came with controlling the only approved source of the medication in the United States. The Theranos blood testing deception. As Shkreli's pharmaceutical schemes were being exposed, another healthcare fraud was reaching its climax in Silicon Valley, where Elizabeth Holmes had spent over a decade building what prosecutors would prove was an elaborate deception that endangered patient lives while defrauding investors of hundreds of millions of dollars. The Theranos scandal represented a perfect storm of Silicon Valley hubris, regulatory failure, and medical fraud that demonstrated how charismatic leadership and sophisticated marketing could maintain a massive lie for years. Holmes founded Theranos in 2003 with the ambitious claim that she had developed revolutionary blood testing technology that could perform hundreds of tests using just a few drops of blood from a simple finger prick. This promise attracted enormous attention from investors, media outlets, and healthcare systems eager to embrace technology that could make medical testing more accessible and affordable. At its peak, Theranos was valued at over $9 billion, making Holmes the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. The technology claims were fundamentally false from the beginning. Internal documents and testimony from former employees revealed that Theranos never developed functional blood testing technology that could deliver on its promises. The company's proprietary Edison machines, which were supposed to revolutionize laboratory testing, were unable to perform most of the tests that Theranos claimed they could handle. Instead, the company secretly used traditional laboratory equipment from other manufacturers, diluting the tiny blood samples to dangerous levels that compromised test accuracy. The medical implications of this deception were severe and potentially life-threatening. Patients who received test results from Theranos were making healthcare decisions based on inaccurate information generated by flawed processes that the company knew were unreliable. Some patients received false positive results that led to unnecessary medical procedures and treatments, while others received false negative results that could have delayed critical medical interventions. The systematic provision of unreliable medical test results represented a fundamental violation of the trust between healthcare providers and patients. The cover-up involved elaborate demonstrations designed to deceive investors, board members, and potential partners about the capabilities of Theranos technology. Holmes orchestrated fake demonstrations where blood tests appeared to be performed using Theranos devices, but were actually conducted using traditional laboratory equipment hidden from view. These theatrical presentations were carefully choreographed to create the illusion of revolutionary technology while concealing the fact that the promised breakthroughs had never been achieved. The corporate culture at Theranos was designed to maintain secrecy and prevent employees from revealing the truth about the company's technological failures. Holmes created an atmosphere of paranoia and intimidation where employees were subjected to extensive surveillance, required to sign restrictive confidentiality agreements, and threatened with legal action if they disclosed information about the company's operations. Former employees described a workplace where questioning the technology or raising concerns about patient safety could result in immediate termination and legal threats. When journalists and whistleblowers began to investigate Theranos and expose the fraud, Holmes and the company launched aggressive legal and public relations campaigns designed to discredit critics and maintain the deception. The company threatened to sue journalists who were investigating the story, hired expensive law firms to intimidate former employees, and used its high-profile board of directors and investors to lend credibility to false claims about technological capabilities. The regulatory response to Theranos revealed significant weaknesses in the oversight of laboratory testing and medical device approval processes. The company was able to operate for years without proper regulatory approval for its testing methods, taking advantage of loopholes in laboratory regulations that allowed them to avoid the rigorous testing and validation requirements that would have exposed the fraud much earlier. When federal prosecutors finally brought charges against Holmes and her former business partner Ramesh Balwani, the evidence revealed the systematic nature of the deception and its devastating impact on investors and patients. Holmes was ultimately convicted on 4 counts of defrauding investors and sentenced to over 11 years in federal prison, while Balwani received a slightly longer sentence for his role in the scheme. The collapse of Theranos sent shockwaves through Silicon Valley and fundamentally changed how investors and regulators evaluate healthcare technology companies. The international money laundering network. While healthcare frauds were capturing headlines, a different type of scandal was quietly unfolding across multiple continents, involving Chinese billionaire Guo Wengui and a sophisticated network designed to extract over $1 billion from investors through a complex web of fake investment opportunities and cryptocurrency schemes. What made this case particularly significant was how it demonstrated the evolution of financial fraud in the digital age, where traditional boundaries between countries and currencies could be exploited to create virtually untraceable criminal enterprises. Guo Wengui had positioned himself as a political dissident and media mogul, building a following among Chinese expatriates and critics of the Beijing government. His public persona as a whistleblower and freedom fighter provided the perfect cover for what prosecutors would later describe as a massive racketeering operation that used political activism as a smokescreen for systematic financial fraud. The sophistication of his operation lay not just in the scale of the theft, but in how he leveraged political narratives and social media influence to create trust among victims who believed they were supporting a legitimate political cause. The scheme involved creating multiple business entities and investment opportunities that appeared to offer everything from media companies to cryptocurrency ventures to luxury lifestyle brands. Each of these ventures was designed to extract money from investors while providing little or no legitimate business value in return. The complexity of the corporate structures, spanning multiple jurisdictions and involving both traditional financial instruments and emerging digital assets, made it extremely difficult for individual investors to understand where their money was actually going or whether the promised returns were realistic. The cryptocurrency component of Guo's operation was particularly sophisticated, taking advantage of the relatively new and poorly understood nature of digital assets to create investment opportunities that appeared legitimate but were actually sophisticated theft mechanisms. Investors were told they were participating in revolutionary blockchain projects that would generate enormous returns while supporting political freedom movements. In reality, their funds were being diverted to support Guo's lavish lifestyle, including luxury real estate purchases, private jets, and expensive cars that had no connection to the supposed business ventures. The cover-up involved creating elaborate documentation and financial statements that gave the appearance of legitimate business operations, while concealing the systematic diversion of investor funds. Guo and his associates produced detailed business plans, financial projections, and marketing materials that painted pictures of thriving enterprises generating substantial revenues and preparing for major expansion. These documents were carefully crafted to satisfy the due diligence requirements of sophisticated investors, while hiding the fact that the underlying businesses were essentially non-existent. What made the fraud particularly devastating was how it exploited the trust and political sympathies of victims who believed they were supporting important political and social causes. Many of the investors were Chinese nationals living abroad who were genuinely concerned about political freedom and human rights issues in their homeland. Guo's public profile as a political activist and critic of the Chinese government created an emotional connection that made potential victims more willing to invest their savings in his various schemes without conducting the careful financial analysis they might have applied to purely commercial investments. The international nature of the operation created significant challenges for law enforcement agencies attempting to track the flow of funds and identify all of the victims and criminal activities. Money moved through bank accounts in multiple countries, cryptocurrency exchanges that operated across borders, and shell companies incorporated in jurisdictions with limited transparency requirements. This complexity was not accidental, but was carefully designed to make it difficult for investigators to follow the money trail and for victims to recover their losses, even after the fraud was exposed. When federal prosecutors finally brought charges against Guo, they discovered that the criminal enterprise had operated for several years and had touched victims in multiple countries who had collectively lost over $1 billion. The case resulted in convictions on 9 separate counts, including racketeering conspiracy, securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering charges that carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison. The scope of the investigation and the international cooperation required to build the case demonstrated how modern financial crimes require unprecedented coordination between law enforcement agencies across different countries and legal systems. The auditing industry corruption crisis. As individual billionaire fraud cases were being prosecuted, a broader pattern was emerging that revealed systemic corruption within the auditing industry itself, where the firms responsible for detecting and preventing financial fraud were actually participating in cover-ups that enabled massive criminal enterprises to continue operating for years. The involvement of major international auditing firms in multiple fraud scandals raised fundamental questions about the independence and reliability of financial reporting systems that investors worldwide depended upon to make informed decisions. The crisis reached its peak with revelations about PricewaterhouseCoopers' role in the Evergrande fraud. But investigations soon revealed that the problems extended far beyond a single case or even a single auditing firm. Deloitte Australia found itself at the center of a Senate inquiry examining allegations of improper auditing practices, conflicts of interest, and the firm's participation in questionable tax avoidance schemes that helped wealthy clients evade their legal obligations while maintaining the appearance of compliance with tax laws. The Australian investigation uncovered a pattern of behavior where auditing firms were essentially operating as business partners with their clients rather than independent verification services. The firms were providing extensive consulting services, tax planning advice, and strategic business guidance to the same companies whose financial statements they were supposed to independently audit. This created obvious conflicts of interest where the auditing firms had financial incentives to maintain positive relationships with client companies even when those companies were engaged in questionable or fraudulent activities. The scope of the problem became clear when investigators discovered that these conflicts of interest were not isolated incidents, but were part of systematic business models where auditing firms generated substantial revenues from consulting services that created dependencies and relationships incompatible with independent auditing responsibilities. The firms had essentially become business partners with their audit clients, making it impossible for them to maintain the objectivity and independence that effective auditing requires. In Hong Kong, similar problems were emerging where local auditing firms were found to have participated in cover-ups involving mainland Chinese companies that were using Hong Kong's financial markets to access international capital while concealing fraudulent activities from overseas investors. These cases demonstrated how the international nature of modern financial markets created opportunities for auditing firms to exploit regulatory gaps and jurisdictional complexities to avoid accountability for their participation in fraudulent schemes. The regulatory response to these revelations was swift but varied significantly between different countries and jurisdictions. Chinese authorities imposed severe penalties and operational restrictions on PwC that effectively shut down significant portions of their business operations in one of the world's largest economies. The 6-month ban on signing off on financial results represented more than just a financial penalty. It was a signal that even the most prestigious international firms would face serious operational consequences for participating in fraud cover-ups. Australian regulators took a different approach, launching comprehensive inquiries into auditing industry practices and considering structural reforms that would separate auditing services from consulting activities to eliminate the conflicts of interest that had enabled so many scandals to continue undetected. The Australian response focused on systemic changes rather than just punishing individual cases, recognizing that the problems were embedded in the business models and incentive structures of the major auditing firms. The Canadian response involved similar inquiries into auditing practices, but with additional focus on how international auditing firms were using their global networks to shift responsibilities and avoid accountability when fraud was discovered. Canadian investigators were particularly interested in how the major auditing firms structured their partnerships and liability arrangements to limit their exposure to consequences when their audits failed to detect or prevent major financial frauds. The cumulative impact of these investigations was to reveal that the auditing industry's problems were not limited to individual cases or specific countries, but represented a global crisis of independence and reliability that threatened the entire system of financial reporting that investors worldwide depended upon. The revelation that major auditing firms were routinely prioritizing their consulting revenues over their auditing responsibilities fundamentally undermined confidence in financial statements and audit reports that had previously been considered reliable indicators of corporate financial health. The cryptocurrency exchange conspiracy network. As traditional auditing scandals were unfolding, the cryptocurrency industry was grappling with its own systematic corruption crisis involving Binance, the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, and its founder Changpeng Zhao, whose operation had become a global hub for money laundering and sanctions violations that threatened international financial stability. The Binance scandal revealed how cryptocurrency exchanges could exploit the decentralized and pseudonymous nature of digital assets to create massive money laundering operations that serve terrorist groups, sanctioned countries, and criminal organizations worldwide. Unlike traditional financial institutions that were subject to extensive anti-money laundering regulations and government oversight, cryptocurrency exchanges had operated in a regulatory gray area that allowed them to process billions of dollars in transactions without implementing adequate controls to prevent criminal activity. The Department of Justice investigation uncovered evidence that Binance had knowingly allowed sanctioned countries like Iran and North Korea to use its platform to evade international economic sanctions and access global financial markets. These transactions weren't accidental oversights or isolated incidents, but represented systematic policies where the exchange prioritized transaction volume and fees over compliance with international law and anti-terrorism regulations. The scale of the money laundering operation was staggering, involving billions of dollars in transactions that flowed through Binance's systems with minimal oversight or verification of the sources and destinations of the funds. Terrorist organizations were able to use the platform to move money internationally. Sanctioned countries could access global markets despite international restrictions, and criminal organizations could launder proceeds from drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other illegal activities through seemingly legitimate cryptocurrency transactions. The cover-up involved creating the appearance of compliance with anti-money laundering regulations while systematically failing to implement the controls and monitoring systems that would have prevented criminal activity. Binance maintained extensive documentation about its compliance policies and procedures, but investigators discovered that these policies existed primarily on paper, while the actual operation of the exchange prioritized transaction volume over regulatory compliance or criminal prevention. The international nature of Binance's operations created additional challenges for law enforcement and regulatory agencies attempting to monitor and control the platform's activities. The exchange operated through a complex network of subsidiaries and partnerships in multiple countries, making it difficult for any single regulatory authority to have complete oversight of its global operations. This jurisdictional complexity was exploited to avoid compliance requirements and shift operations away from countries that attempted to impose stricter regulatory controls. When authorities finally imposed consequences for Binance's systematic violations of anti-money laundering and sanctions laws, the penalties were severe enough to fundamentally change the cryptocurrency exchange industry's approach to regulatory compliance. Changpeng Zhao was required to step down as CEO and faced personal criminal charges, while Binance itself was subjected to extensive monitoring and compliance requirements that effectively ended its ability to operate as a largely unregulated global financial platform. The Binance case demonstrated how cryptocurrency exchanges had become critical infrastructure for global money laundering and sanctions evasion, highlighting the urgent need for comprehensive regulatory frameworks that could address the unique challenges posed by decentralized digital assets while preserving the innovative potential of blockchain technology. The resolution of the case marked a turning point in cryptocurrency regulation, where exchanges could no longer operate with minimal oversight while processing billions of dollars in transactions that might involve criminal activity. The Pharmaceutical Pricing Manipulation Network. The Pharmaceutical Pricing Manipulation Network continued to evolve beyond individual cases, like Martin Shkreli's Daraprim scandal, revealing systematic industry practices, where pharmaceutical companies were coordinating to manipulate pricing and market access for essential medications. These schemes involved complex arrangements between manufacturers, distributors, and pharmacy benefit managers that created artificial scarcities and inflated prices for drugs that patients needed to survive. The coordination involved creating exclusive distribution agreements that prevented generic competitors from entering markets, even after patents had expired, and regulatory approvals had been granted for alternative medications. Pharmaceutical companies would pay substantial fees to distributors and pharmacy benefit managers to maintain exclusive positions that allowed them to charge inflated prices without competitive pressure from alternative suppliers. The corruption extended beyond simple price manipulation to include systematic market manipulation, where pharmaceutical companies would coordinate to prevent competition and maintain artificially high pricing across entire therapeutic categories. These arrangements involved complex financial instruments and rebate structures that appeared to promote competition, but actually reinforced monopolistic pricing power while creating barriers to entry for potential competitors who might offer more affordable alternatives. The most sophisticated aspect of these schemes involved exploiting regulatory processes to delay generic drug approvals and extend patent protections far beyond their intended duration. Pharmaceutical companies would file numerous frivolous patents on minor variations of existing medications, creating legal obstacles that generic manufacturers would have to overcome through expensive and time-consuming litigation processes that could delay competition for years or even decades. The cover-up involved creating the appearance of legitimate business competition while secretly coordinating to maintain high prices and prevent market entry by potential competitors. Companies would publicly announce price reductions or patient assistance programs that generated positive media coverage, while simultaneously implementing complex rebate structures and distribution agreements that maintained their actual pricing power and profit margins without providing meaningful relief to patients who needed affordable medications. When congressional investigations began examining pharmaceutical pricing practices, they discovered extensive documentation showing that companies had deliberately created artificial scarcities for essential medications, not because of manufacturing difficulties or supply chain problems, but because limited availability allowed them to charge higher prices without competitive pressure from alternative suppliers or generic equivalents. The international pharmaceutical pricing conspiracy extended beyond American markets to include coordination between companies operating in multiple countries, where they would use different regulatory systems and patent laws to maintain pricing power across global markets while preventing arbitrage opportunities that might allow patients to access more affordable medications from countries with better price controls. The offshore banking nexus. As investigators traced the money flows from these various scandals, they uncovered a sophisticated network of offshore financial institutions that served as the backbone for virtually every major billionaire fraud scheme of the past decade. These weren't traditional tax havens operating in isolation, but rather interconnected systems of banks, shell companies, and financial service providers that had evolved specifically to facilitate large-scale criminal enterprises while maintaining plausible deniability for their wealthy clients. The sophistication of these offshore networks went far beyond simple numbered accounts and anonymous corporations. Modern criminal enterprises required complex financial structures that could move billions of dollars across international borders, while creating multiple layers of legal protection and regulatory confusion that would slow down or prevent law enforcement agencies from tracing the ultimate sources and destinations of criminal proceeds. These networks had evolved to anticipate and counter the investigative techniques that authorities use to track financial crimes. The coordination between offshore jurisdictions was remarkable in its scope and effectiveness. Small island nations, European financial centers, and emerging market countries had essentially created a parallel financial system that operated according to different rules and standards than the regulated banking systems that ordinary citizens and legitimate businesses were required to use. This parallel system allowed criminal enterprises to access sophisticated financial services while avoiding the reporting requirements, transaction monitoring, and regulatory oversight that would expose their activities to law enforcement scrutiny. The professional service ecosystem that supported these offshore networks included some of the world's most prestigious law firms, accounting companies, and financial advisors who provided the technical expertise and regulatory knowledge necessary to structure complex criminal enterprises in ways that could withstand legal challenges and regulatory investigations. These professionals didn't just provide routine services, but actively participated in designing and implementing criminal schemes while maintaining their reputations as legitimate service providers. The Bank of Shadows scandal revealed how traditional European banking institutions had created entire departments dedicated to serving criminal enterprises and corrupt government officials from around the world. Internal documents obtained by investigators showed that senior bank executives had knowingly approved account openings and transaction processing for clients they knew were engaged in money laundering, sanctions violations, and systematic corruption, while maintaining public commitments to compliance and ethical banking practices. The scale of criminal money flowing through these institutions was breathtaking in its magnitude and consistency. Billions of dollars in proceeds from drug trafficking, human trafficking, arms dealing, and political corruption moved through major European banks on a daily basis, processed by systems that were specifically designed to avoid detection while generating substantial fee income for the institutions that handled these transactions. The banks had essentially become partners in global criminal enterprises while maintaining their positions as respected financial institutions. These 10 scandals represent more than isolated cases of individual greed and corruption. They reveal a systematic architecture of deception that spans continents, industries, and regulatory systems, demonstrating how wealth and power can be weaponized to create criminal enterprises that operate with virtual impunity while devastating the lives of ordinary people who trusted these institutions with their savings, their health, and their futures. The pattern is unmistakable. Sophisticated networks of enablers, from prestigious auditing firms to offshore banking systems, work together to maintain elaborate cover-ups that protect billionaire criminals while shifting the costs of their crimes onto society as a whole. What emerges from these investigations isn't just evidence of individual wrongdoing, but proof of a parallel financial system designed specifically to serve criminal enterprises, while maintaining the appearance of legitimacy and respectability that allows these schemes to continue operating for decades. If you learned something from this video, then you have to check out our last video on some coincidences we found that may not be so coincidental. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend. Don't keep these discoveries as a secret to yourself. Until next time, when we find out how.